So I'm going to take a guess here if I did my math right, but I don't have a clock that it's afternoon. So good afternoon, Chair Ziebelman and Commissioners. My name is Bart Fernie. I work for National Grid. It's an honor to be presenting here today on behalf of the DSPP Market Committee, but just a quick disclaimer, I am presenting on behalf of the committee, and nothing I say should be misrepresented as representing National Grid's position. What you have before you here is a high-level schematic of largely relationships between DSPP's customers and third parties. What the committee had agreed to is that the DSPP would facilitate integrated resource planning, maintain customer engagement, provide services such as metering and financing options, and aggregate transactional services between the DERs and the ISO. Last but not least, the DSPP working group spent a lot of time on identifying products that would benefit customers and the distribution system. Critical to the initial model will be product valuation and pricing through regulated tariffs. And just a quick nod to Commissioner Brown's observation that this looks a lot like what we have today, but if you peel back the onion, which we'll get into later slides, you'll see that it is a scope issue, and it is very much a change in the paradigm from what we have today. So the initial model is the utility role. Committee largely agrees that that entering into a market-based system in the near term is unrealistic. As an initial matter, the utility should be the DSPP, or was mentioned, I like the phrase, it was mentioned on the prior panel, DSPP 1.0, that should be the utility. DSPPs would identify areas where DERs have near-term value. This information is necessary to develop sufficient price signals that reflect distribution system needs, planning, and real-time operations. DSPP should explore DER opportunities as alternatives to T&D investments through targeted RFPs or regulated rates. In addition to product valuation, the DSPP would need to establish visibility into the performance of new and existing resources in order to reliably account for performance in planning, and so DERs have an expectation of what their revenue would be based on whatever technology that they would like to pursue. So where feasible, utilities should work towards standardizing products and protocols so DER providers and service providers can operate seamlessly between the DSPP. And I think that's been a reoccurring theme that I've heard on the prior panel as well, is that seamless operation between DSPP and Region A and B. We should try to uniform that, and I know that the utilities recognize that is a ask and a need that they need to focus in on that. Not to say that, as Commissioner Brown again noted, that the differences between, say, the Con Ed service territory distribution system and, say, the National Grid service territory are not always going to be aligned, so there will be practical differences. So the initial model, potential regulatory action. Obviously, one of the reasons why we're here today is because regulatory action is needed to help facilitate DSPP procurement of DERs. This is going to be a regulatory journey, I would say, that takes us to the end state of REV. Some near-term regulatory actions identified by the committee include guidance on, I should change this. There we go, sorry. Guidance on products or values to be monetized and develop appropriate metrics, adopt cost-benefit evaluation methodologies for DERs as a potential alternative to T&D investment, leverage and expand existing programs as a bridge to sufficient DER penetration, and I believe that the Commission is doing that in other cases as well. In order to successfully integrate DERs into the system so that the benefits to customers and network operators can be realized, it is essential that the utilities ready to their systems and create platforms such as communication, monitoring, and dispatch of distribution-level DER. And that was the primary focus and objective of the prior panel. In order to achieve a critical mass of DERs that would be necessary to have established markets, the Commission would need to revise utility tariffs and policies. And given that the enactment of new rates for DERs where we can monetize those values and attributes that they provide, it would only make sense that the Commission also review existing rates and policies and look at it more holistically and ensure that we're doing the right thing in an economical fashion for customers and that the whole package hangs together. I should note that the examples given here and prior were also, we didn't achieve consensus on some of these issues. Some folks very strongly believe that they don't go far enough. Others believe that they went too far, and particularly in terms of cost allocation for power assurance and network service. But we're not, fortunately, we don't have to deal with those today, but just to say we all agree that they need to be looked at in the future. Continuing on with other potential regulatory actions, there are, of course, well-known technical challenges that the utility and the Commission will need to address, notably equipment limitations associated with two-way power flow. The Commission should provide incentives for what I term rev service through performance-based rate making in order for the utilities to pursue DER deployment opportunities and achieve targets. Some essential changes necessary to achieve the end state of the REV are transitioning to advanced metering technologies, direct load control where economic, and develop a common DSPP portal to exchange information and solicit interest in products between utilities, customers, DER providers, ESCOs, and other third parties. For the benefit of customers, the Commission should also ensure rules are in place to create level playing fields and give all parties equal opportunity to compete in this new, under this new paradigm. Critical to that is keeping an eye on FERC-regulated products and future attribute pricing that might occur there at the wholesale level. And lastly, the Commission should be prepared to address changing needs and impacts. Some things, obviously, hopefully, we're going to get right initially, but we also must realize that some things will need to change. So we can't be particularly wedded to one set of constructs if they're not working, again, in a holistic fashion. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'll take any questions before turning it over to Molly.
Questions? Okay. I think that the model, the model you've identified within terms of the initial roles, those are the areas that you would say are there consensus, or is there disagreement in terms of some of these initial activities that you've identified?
I think there's largely consensus around the fact that we've identified products that benefit the distribution system and customers that aren't currently being monetized. So as an initial model, we would need to pursue the valuation and pricing of that. And also we've agreed that the utilities should identify locations where the DERs would provide the most benefit. A lot of people refer to that as hosting capacity, and what we have in terms of hosting capacity on lines today versus maybe some lines are maxed out and would require to be developed further in terms of infrastructure hardening. So I think that there largely is consensus around getting going on what we need to do, but we have to, obviously, there's a next step.
I guess if I could just add to that, I agree with what Bart said. I just want to make one more point to it, though, with respect to the various products, because there are some products, and particularly energy storage falls into this, where if you value half of its benefits, you may not get the penetration you want. So the challenge that came out in some of these discussions, which particularly got to the kind of good, healthy battle that Bart and I and others have been having about capacity and energy, but those pieces play into things that do need to be looked at and evaluated, because what ends up happening is that if you take a large energy storage system in New York City, for instance, and you know it gives you 10 benefits or 5 benefits, and you say I'm going to pay for 2 of them, you may not get that energy storage system in New York City. So in some cases you will, but in some cases you won't. And so we'd encourage that we look at the suite of products and be very careful as to how we do this stepwise progression.
So on that, I mean, you know, I think that the point that you made, Bart, and certainly Commissioner Brown made about there's obviously a differentiation in terms of the type of systems we have in this state. But it does seem that there's going to be some commonality around product definition, so that you would say, for example, we all are going to need products that can respond within a 5-minute notification and can provide a reactive service.
Yep.
And that each utility should have, or each DSPP should have, a product definition around that, because that unpacks the value proposition. And that is consistent. How much they need and where they need it obviously would vary based on the actual configuration of the system, but there is electricity works the same as far as I know everywhere in the world, and so that would be helpful to get that. Is that what you're saying in terms of the commonality versus differentiation?
Right, but in that case, for instance, if you have a system that's providing that reactive power, but then you say that system cannot provide capacity or it cannot put energy onto the grid, it may not be economical just to provide the reactive power. So this is the challenge with doing it, and I'm going to do one product at a time when the same device can do 3 products. And that's where I think it's a little trickier, and we need to look at this. And I'm not saying that's a barrier to entry completely, but it's something I think we need to look at as we're constructing this system.
David, did you have something?
I just wanted to unpack that a little bit on the environmental side too. I mean, I think it's an important component of the discussion that we had, that there are some, specifically on the environmental values, there are some universal benefits to society from reducing carbon, for instance, but there are also some very specific benefits to a local community related to reducing other kinds of emissions, SOx and NOx and that sort of thing. So I think unpacking those values, as we've discussed and as the committee agreed, is a critical next step, but that's just another piece of it that needs to be considered when we're monetizing this going forward.
And those public policy benefits, I'll just add on to what David's saying. Utilities are good at determining costs of infrastructure, avoided costs, and tangible benefits, but not to say that public policy isn't tangible, but how to monetize those values is something definitely is going to be a challenge and what would be required from you all.
That's why we get paid the big bucks.
That's right.
Somebody mentioned interconnection costs, I think, kind of as a barrier to entry, et cetera. Was there much discussion about changing the paradigm? I mean, the traditional paradigm today is that it's a causal effect. If somebody wants to interconnect in the system and it requires huge system upgrades, they got to pay for the huge system upgrades. Back in the old ISO days, you'd be the straw that broke the camel's back. Eventually, the one guy got hit with a $4 billion bill because he happened to be the guy that took you over the limit. I know, working with people with anaerobic digesters, they sit in bad places. Sometimes the cost of the interconnection ended up being as much as the cost of the equipment. Was there any discussion at all? I mean, I know we could try to make it quicker, but I think sometimes the cost is just as important as the quick. Was there any discussion of that at all?
I think generally there was discussion about costs overall for these resources, interconnection costs being one of those costs. I don't know, Bill, do you want to?
Yeah, not to the level, Commissioner Brown, that you would desire. I think it was noted and people put in input about it, but given the time frame, there was a lot of discussion about the actual cost. It was, I think, most of the comments that we received were more around time than cost, but certainly that's an important factor.
A quick answer, that's $27 billion, probably isn't that useful. So.
I think it was also brought up in the context of valuation that if you're maxed out on your hosting capacity, obviously the one more that breaks the camel's back, you're probably at the point where the revenue stream that would be associated to that new resource isn't going to be as great as it was when, say, there was a need there.
And isn't that, I thought, by doing the integrated planning,
Yeah.
and having the DSPP identify where a resource could be beneficial on a system versus a cost to the system is actually something that was missing in the wholesale market.
Right.
And consequently, people didn't know where to put their generators, and we ended up with systems behind constraints rather than helping solve constraints.
Right.
So hopefully we'll have learned a little bit from that experience.
Deliverability rules that we now developed in the ISOs.
Right. And the other thing that I think we'll have to deal with on a policy basis, because it's different, is if we start looking at these resources as resources to help support the grid, it actually changes as to whether these interconnections are private resources or, frankly, used and useful, and therefore baked into the traditional rate base. Right. So that changes the dynamic as well.
And there were comments about sort of partnering, if you can share the cost, if it's a benefit to the distribution system as well as a benefit to the
Right.
DER provider.
And I guess then the hard issue is sometimes something looks like a cost and turns into a benefit and vice versa. So it'll be, but good. Thank you. Ms. Lampe, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Zibelman, and good afternoon now, Commissioners. My name is Molly Lampe. I am an Assistant General Counsel with the New York ISO, and I'm happy to be here today to share with you the thoughts and concerns of the subgroup on wholesale market integration. I'd like to take a minute to thank the participants on this subgroup for the time they devoted to these issues. There was a lively debate. And there was a lot of real, honest back and forth, which I appreciated. I think as I go through some of the thoughts that the subgroup had on integration, that you'll hear some common themes that you've heard both from other members of this panel and from, frankly, the technology folks that you heard from this morning. As this slide indicates, we thought we'd give you a very, very broad brush overview of the markets that the NYSO currently operates. We operate a capacity market and co-optimized energy and ancillary service markets. Demand-side resources can participate in the day-ahead energy market, the capacity market, and as an ancillary services provider in both the day-ahead and real-time markets. The ISO also uses demand response resources as emergency resources for reliability. A description of the NYSO's markets and how demand response can fit into those markets is available in the Commissioner's packets, and it is also on the web. This slide provides examples that the group came up with on interactions among distributed resources, the DSPP, and the wholesale market. As a retail load provider, the DSPP will be buying energy in the wholesale market. DSPP's use of distributed resources could increase the efficiency of these energy purchases by flattening the DSPP's wholesale demand curve, particularly during high-priced periods. The DSPP, I think, has already been mentioned, could also act as an aggregator of its customers' demand response and sell it into the wholesale market. Visibility and control of distributed resources to the DSPP is vital. And here you hear that word again, visibility. Some distributed resources are intended to change customer elasticities by altering their electric consumption in reaction to price. Others are visible to and controllable by the DSPP. The more visibility and control the DSPP takes over these distributed resources that are not in the ISO markets, the more it can enhance market efficiency and operational control. Operational control also provides reliability benefits. At the wholesale level, resource visibility and ability to direct resource actions and coordination help maintain reliable service and efficient markets. The DSPP's use of these tools would provide it with similar benefits. Where visibility and control will be limited, for solar PV, for instance, forecasting methodologies will need to be developed and refined to minimize any negative impacts on reliability or market efficiencies that may be associated with these variable resources. Increased use of distributed resources in offering energy and load reduction to both the wholesale market and to purchasers at the distribution level will require close alignment of the rules for participating in each of these arenas. Aligned market rules will ensure that distributed resource participation is efficient, appropriately valued, and properly paid. Poor alignment could actually impact reliability. Let me give you an example. If the same megawatts of load reduction are offered to the wholesale market and also to provide a local benefit like avoided distribution investment, coordinating its participation for each purpose is vital. If, for instance, the load reduction is called upon to provide the local benefit, perhaps during a short time frame over a series of hours on particular days, it would need to withdraw its offer to the wholesale market for the same period. Otherwise, the wholesale market would be expecting to be able to call upon that load reduction, and it would not be available. The working group also felt that revisions to the NYSO's market rules may also be necessary in this effort. The group agreed, however, that formal discussion of changes to wholesale market rules really belongs in the NYSO stakeholder process. As this slide shows, assessing the short-term impact on the wholesale market of an increase in distributed resources is key to maximizing the benefits of the DSPP's interaction with the NYSO. Understanding short-term impacts is particularly important to help avoid unanticipated adverse outcomes. The working group wanted to share its cautionary notes on this issue. In the working group's mind, the impacts of an increased penetration of distributed resources, particularly on the NYSO's resource commitment process, its real-time operations, and its ability to satisfy all reliability rules and requirements, need to be anticipated in advance and managed. An example of a potential adverse outcome that can be avoided is the impact of distributed resources on the NYSO's unit commitment process. Distributed resources that are utilized and known by the DSPP but not reflected in the day-ahead commitment could result in an overcommitment of wholesale generation and present higher costs to consumers. The working group also suggests that when new market rules are being introduced, time needs to be spent looking ahead for potential consequences. Unintended outcomes can require extensive redesign. This slide explains that a good understanding of the impacts of an increase in distributed resources is particularly important for retail and wholesale utility planners. DSPPs need to be aware of where distributed resources are being installed in order to appropriately account for the value they provide and the reliability impacts they may create. DSPPs will need this data to accurately forecast their wholesale energy needs hour by hour and to maintain the reliability of the distribution network. Programs to involve more distributed resources in distribution system operations must be designed with visibility, measurement, and verification systems in place to allow load forecasters and system planners to appropriately account for their presence on the system. Aligning measurement and verification rules and metrics between the wholesale and distribution programs will facilitate this job. Finally, as noted in the first bullet on this slide, there was broad debate in the working group on the need for an expansive review of long-term impacts of distributed resource penetrations on the wholesale market and the bulk electric system. Areas of concern include impacts on reliability, the potential need to increase regulation in other ancillary services, and impacts on the amount of capacity New York needs to procure to meet future peak loads and necessary reserves. Impacts on production costs could also be studied. The working group, though, purposefully avoided describing a responsible entity or a timetable for this study. Everyone agreed it needed to be done, though. Finally, the working group did also spend a fair amount of time on how to maintain strong retail distributed resource involvement in the wholesale market, notwithstanding the uncertainty that the recent D.C. Circuit Court's ruling on the FERC Order 745 may have. The working group agreed that the value that distributed resources provide today to the wholesale market can continue despite this uncertainty, and the DSPP model can certainly enhance that continuation. Some of the existing interactions that should continue are shaping customers' peak energy use, providing installed capacity benefits either by reducing installed capacity purchase obligations or by satisfying ICAP obligations with additional supply. Using distributed resources to reduce overall energy purchases can also improve procurement efficiencies. The working group did particularly focus, though, on how to continue the reliability benefits that retail load reduction currently provides to the wholesale market if the district court's decision is upheld and its holding is applied to a broader set of wholesale programs. The working group felt that the use of distributed resources for this purpose could continue if the DSPPs designed programs to provide load reduction at the NYSO's request with a payment stream that would come from the DSPP. Of course, that would require timely and transparent compensation to the DSPP for the reliability benefits its customers provide through its activities and therefore for its administrative costs. That concludes my presentation. If there are any questions?
Thank you. For obvious reasons, I'm going to avoid the double payment issue. But I'd like to actually talk a little bit about whether there was any discussion, what I think is a really part and parcel of why we're doing it this way as opposed to other ways. And that was the comment about increasing regulation and reactive service. It strikes me that the way we are actually pursuing this in New York is actually to avoid the problems that we see in other states and other countries where they've ignored the potential value of using distributed resources to solve the problem really at the edge of the system, so that rather than having to procure reactive power and regulation services from the wholesale market, that the distribution utilities end up helping manage that, because those are procurally issues that are closest to load and can often be provided most inexpensively when provided by load. So I would hope that as we're pursuing this, when we think about impacts, we're actually thinking about the positive impacts that can be created to the system by making load more dynamic and controllable rather than thinking about it as a problem that the wholesale system needs to solve. I think that to me is the debate that we're having on a national front, is the management of demand, which is really the management of that the retail entities and therefore the retail regulators care about, rather than seeing as a problem for the wholesale market, is really a solution to the wholesale market. And that one of the things that maybe wasn't picked up, but I hope is picked up somewhere, that we're really talking about then defining products so that we can actually integrate wind, solar, and other intermittent technologies much more efficiently and effectively in New York, because we're recognizing that there's a whole value stream really at the edge of the system that could be used to accommodate a much more dynamic system. And I think maybe when we think about the products, we also need to think about the products that the DSPP, and maybe your last bullet picks up on this, can start providing to the wholesale market, so we don't have problems that other regions have about how do we integrate wind, how do we integrate solar, because we're actually thinking about this as we model out the DSPP. You're shaking your head, so I hope that was part of the discussion.
No, those are very good points, and the opportunity for DSPPs to provide ancillary services was definitely discussed, and there was various opinions on how that can do. I appreciate your note, though, about the opportunities that loads may have to offload some of the otherwise necessary obligations at the wholesale level.
The way we were structured, the discussion occurred in two locations. It occurred in the location of the main group with the products part that David presented. And if you look in the spreadsheets, there's more details about some of those services that could be considered there. And then the separate group that looked about the interaction with the ISO, where they were also caught. So there's two places that this works into the report.
One of the things that concerns me, and I wonder if the group considered, is a possible severe disconnect between how we do retail pricing and how wholesale prices are set. Along the lines of, if we take the full value of DER at the retail level and we consider the social benefits, the lower emissions, economic benefits, jobs, what have you, and cook those into retail rates. But that's not being done on the wholesale side. Yet you have central generating stations that actually provide many of these same benefits. Low emissions, no carbon, lots of jobs. Are we potentially causing some unintended uneconomic results, and maybe even pushing out some otherwise good plants from the market that we shouldn't be pushing out, and how do we avoid that?
Let me just say that I don't think the wholesale subgroup really got into that kind of detail. I think those are absolutely fascinating questions that need to be reviewed. I do think the wholesale subgroup did understand, though, that when a DSPP is looking at a choice of using a distributed resource as an energy supplier for its load that it has locally available, as opposed to buying energy from the wholesale market, there will be a price differentiation between those two resources. And at least at the ISO, the difference in which resource you use is generally price-based. So that may be where those two markets come together. But it wasn't a broadly discussed issue, although I think it was acknowledged that it's there.
I would just say that I think that you touch upon a very legitimate concern as well, that from a customer perspective, the whole thing should be, what works and what benefits them. Not to say that, well, there can't be price separation between the two resources, particularly if you get down to granular benefits. And like Chair Ziebelman noted, if there's more benefits due to location here and versus what you need to deliver into that locality from a centralized network, then it should be priced out accordingly. But I think that where we need to stay away from is assigning value to attributes or impacts that aren't captured elsewhere, probably for very good reasons as well.
When you mentioned aligning measurement and verification, was there consensus on that?
There was consensus on the need to have alignment, but I don't believe we intended that mean that they be exactly alike.
I think Commissioner Sayre brings up a good point, but it does. My question is that there's sort of two functionalities that I know that we're sort of confronted here. One is, how do you integrate and accelerate DER resources where appropriate and where it can provide value? And I think that the value statements that the Commission needs to look at are going to be independent of whether it comes from customer-based resources or the grid itself. So things like that we identified when we set up this docket: fuel diversity, emission reduction, jobs, economic development, those types of things that we are interested in. I don't think we would ever expect that the wholesale market, the FERC, would identify those, because those are really subject to state regulation, not federal regulation. But from the standpoint of how we regulate utilities and incent utilities, if we get it right, they'll choose the most efficient resources, whether they come from the wholesale grid or from DER resources. So the objective will remain the same. What we're trying to deal with now, obviously, is a recognition that there's never been a market for distributed resources at all. And so we need to think about how we do both. But I don't think we're really going to be setting up if it comes from inside the distribution utility, it provides more value or different types of values than if it comes from the bulk power grid. Just what are we going to value in terms of our economic outcomes that we want the distribution utilities to achieve, which is, I think our difficulty is in a restructured environment. On some hand, we've restructured. On the other hand, we have things like 111D confronting us that provide obligations to the state that we have to meet on a much more holistic version. So complicated issue, but I think that we're trying to do both. Thank you. That was more of a comment than a question. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
So before I summarize, I'd just like to ask my co-conveners out there in Siberia if you want to add anything more to the presentation. No? Okay. So I'll just go through quickly some of the points that you heard. So while we recognize that DER and DER products and services exist today, under the REV construct, it's expected that new and innovative products and services will develop in the future. And I think we've heard a few times today that we need to design markets, platforms, and rules to allow flexibility for that to happen. In order to fully achieve the goals of the REV initiative, including more efficient use of the distribution and bulk power systems, additional resources and better utilization of existing resources is likely needed. There are a number of challenges to further integration of DER, and in the initial stage, the utilities will likely play a key role in further developing and utilizing DER. DER providers will also have a key role. For example, we heard about the need for more information sharing between both the utilities and the DER, keeping in mind what Commissioner Brown alluded to with respect to privacy issues and cybersecurity. There are regulatory actions that can help facilitate DER development. We heard examples of performance-based regulatory design and tariffs and pricing. The New York ISO market rules also need to be aligned to ensure efficient use of DER products. And finally, approaches to increasing the penetration of DER should occur systematically, reliably, and as we heard, safely. But again, with as much flexibility and as much standardization as appropriate. So in closing, I'd like to thank all of the participants in the committee for their time and input. I especially want to thank the steering committee members, my co-conveners, and other staff committee members who dedicated many hours to this effort. The interest in this effort was overwhelming, to say the least. I believe the information gathered through this process will be very useful information and guidance to the Commission as it proceeds with the REV initiative. And with that, if there's no other questions.
Thank you. And again, our appreciation. It was a lot of hard work. And this probably more so than any working group, it was probably really impossible to differentiate between policy issues versus fact-finding. And I know we really appreciate the fact that you tried to get to where you could get consensus, but recognize that there are differences in policy. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we'll now adjourn for lunch. We're going to reconvene at 1:30. Thank you.